Hello, my name is Kate Crowley and I'm in the program of Speech Language Pathology here at Teachers College, Columbia University. Welcome to Module 1 of this module series, Grammar Fundamentals for a Pluralistic Society, that I've created with my co-author, Chad Grossman. In this module series, we'll discuss the fundamentals of Standard American English morphosyntax. Here we use the term Standard American English not to imply that other dialectal varieties of English are improper, inferior, or substandard in any way, but simply because this is the term favored by linguists. In fact, what we'll demonstrate in these modules is that Standard American English, or SAE, is one dialect among many, which are all systematic and rule-governed. We'll also highlight some morphosyntactic features of American English dialects and language transfer in English language learners, or ELLS, and identify important considerations in assessing the language of children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So the first question that we need to answer is, why is it important for us to know grammar? Well, an SLP not knowing grammar is like a surgeon not knowing anatomy. That illustration is by Tina Young, and that's supposedly Chad and myself. We have to have a thorough understanding of grammar in order to assess, treat, and monitor an individual's language abilities in a meaningful and systematic way. Take specific language impairment, or SLI, for example, which is a language delay not accounted for by any other developmental delay and can specifically affect the development of grammar. A child with SLI might say something like, "He eat the apple." In this case, we need to know that this child is omitting the inflectional morpheme S associated with the third person singular form of the verb to eat. So in order to assess the language abilities of this child and determine the necessity and direction of treatment, we have to be able to analyze their language and know what grammatical structures are being affected. And this is not just limited to SLI. We need to have a fluent understanding of grammar in order to appropriately analyze and treat any population's language abilities. Grammar is also part of the Common Core language strand. Our children are expected to demonstrate command of the conventions of standard English grammar and usage, so we need to be able to demonstrate command of these conventions as well. Further, we have to have a good understanding of the structure of clauses, phrases, and sentences in order to assess and treat the language of older students beyond the age of 3 who have acquired the use of morphemes. We also need a deep understanding of grammar in order to adequately differentiate a language disorder from a language difference or dialect. The American Speech Language and Hearing Association's statement on the knowledge and skills needed by audiologists and speech-language pathologists to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate services indicates that we need to know how the linguistic features and learning characteristics of language differences and second language acquisition are different from those associated with a true learning disability. So here it is in black and white. This is the knowledge that we're expected to have as professionals. We generally call something a language difference when an individual speaks a dialect or language other than Standard American English and no language disorder or delay is present. What we'll demonstrate throughout this module series is that some features of language differences may present as errors in Standard American English, even though they are grammatically correct in that person's dialect or language. So these errors don't demonstrate a language disability, but rather demonstrate an ability to use language in accordance with what the student has been exposed to. So to determine whether a disorder exists, we must look at the typical development of a language or dialect that a person speaks. Traditional methods of language analysis, such as Brown's morphemes, Bloom and Leahy's form, and Standard American English MLU analysis, are likely to misidentify language differences as disorders because they are based on the Standard American English dialect. For example, If we go back to our child with specific language impairment, we need to know that omission of the third person singular S in flexional morpheme is grammatically correct in many varieties of English spoken in the United States, including African American English, Spanish-influenced English, Chinese-influenced English, many West Indian English dialects, Guyanese English, and many, many Southern dialects, just to name a few. Dialects are rule-based linguistic varieties within a language. Many people think that dialectal variations are just lexical in nature, like the difference between someone saying soda and someone saying pop. Lexical variations, however, are just one feature of a dialect. Other features include phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and suprasegmental features. Everyone speaks at least one dialect, including those who speak only Standard American English, like myself. Factors that relate to dialectal differences include geography, history, social and cultural background, and even socioeconomic background. There are hundreds of dialects and language differences in the United States. In these lecture series, we'll specifically address four due to their prevalence in New York City and throughout the country: Standard American English, or SAE, African American English, or AAE, Spanish-influenced English, and Chinese-influenced English. Standard American English is the dialect generally spoken in American classrooms. It can be called newscaster's English and is used in professional and academic writing. Again, we use the term standard here out of convention and not to imply that other varieties of English are improper, inferior, or substandard. African American English is a rule-based and systematic dialect that is not an improper form of English. It's important to note that not all African Americans speak African American English, and not all speakers of African American English are African American. For example, children of Latino, Asian, or European origin may speak African American English because it's the dialect of their peers. The manner in which two languages interact can also create dialectal variations. English language learners, or ELLS, may demonstrate characteristic differences in their use of the English language due to interference, or really transfer, between their first language, or L1, and English. So for example, a Spanish-speaking child who is learning English might say something like, "Put the apple in the plate," instead of "put the apple on the plate." This is because the Spanish language demonstrates different prepositional forms than Standard American English. For example, in Spanish, en can mean either in or on, depending on the context. Saying "put the apple in the plate" might sound like an error in Standard American English, but it's not indicative of a disorder if the child is a Spanish-speaking L, or this is a feature of that child's speech community. Spanish-influenced English consists of characteristic language differences due to the language transfer from Spanish to English. For example, an L of Hispanic background may say something like, "Put the apple in the plate," due to the difference in preposition use because N represents both in and on, or say something like, "The duck yellow," because the Spanish language exhibits a different word order than Standard American English. Again, these characteristics are not indicative of a disorder if that child is an L of Latino heritage, or if this is a feature of that child's speech community. Let's move on to Chinese-influenced English. Some of the major varieties of Chinese spoken in New York City include Mandarin, Taiwanese, Cantonese, and Fujianese. ELLS of Chinese heritage may show characteristic language differences due to transfer from Chinese to English. For example, you may hear something like, "He have two shoe." This is because Chinese doesn't demonstrate subject-verb agreement and plural inflection in the same way that Standard American English does. In Standard American English, one would say, "He has two shoes." An L of Chinese heritage, however, might say, "He have two shoe," due to the difference in subject-verb agreement, have versus has, and plural inflection, two shoe versus two shoes. Does that mean this student has a language disorder? No. We might expect an L of Chinese heritage to demonstrate these characteristic features of interference or transfer between Chinese and English. A study by Paradis in 2005 provided evidence that typically developing children acquiring English exhibit errors on standardized tests that are similar to the performance of monolingual children with specific language impairment. This study also gives more detailed examples of common errors made by ELLS versus children with SLI. This evidence helps us understand how inappropriate standardized tests are for ELLS and bilinguals when those standardized tests are based on standard American English. Paradis shows how standardized test scores are at the heart of the current crisis in special education, specifically relating to over-referral and misdiagnosis of children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. As a result, it is of utmost importance to develop good clinical judgment about the population you work with so that informed and accurate decisions can be made regarding diagnosis. Now, it is also important to note that monolingual English speakers growing up in Latino or Chinese communities may present the same characteristics of Spanish-influenced English or Chinese-influenced English, not as a direct result of L1 transfer, but rather because it's a dialectal feature within their own speech community. For example, a monolingual English-speaking child growing up in a Latino community might say, I go to the bodega for that street instead of I go to the bodega on that street. This comes from the Spanish, voy a la tienda por esa calle. But these children may not speak any Spanish at all. They're using the features of Spanish-influenced English because that's a feature of the speech community's English that they've grown up in, even though they don't speak Spanish. This is why it's so important that we know the speech community and cultural and linguistic community that a student comes from. Otherwise, that student might be diagnosed with a language disorder when really they're using language in accordance with what they have been exposed to. Let's briefly go over some grammatical features that are common in many dialects of English. If you don't know any of these grammatical terms, don't worry. We'll cover them in depth over the course of this module series. One common grammatical feature of many English dialects is the regularization of irregular plurals. So, they growed a lot. The term grow is an irregular past tense verb in standard American English, grew. Regular past tense verbs are formed by the addition of an ed, so growed is a regularization of that irregular verb. Many dialects of English may also use irregulars differently. Instead of saying brought, which is an irregular verb in standard American English, we may see the use of the word brung. Many dialects also use the auxiliary and instead of have not, as in, I ain't seen her for a long time. We can also see exchange of the past participle and simple past, as in, I seen it, she done her homework, we could have went, I had went down there, and he may have took the money. If you notice, all the verbs are irregular verbs. In the first two sentences, the participle form of the verb see seen and do done is used as the simple past tense. In the next four sentences, the simple past tense of the verb is used instead of the past participle gone and taken. Are these forms correct? Not if we expect that everyone is exposed to standard American English. But if we are to distinguish a disorder from a difference, then we have to look at whether the child has been exposed to varieties of English that use these forms. If so, then the child has appropriately acquired the language of the environment, showing good language learning and not a disorder. Another common dialectal feature is the extension of object forms to coordinate subjects, such as me and him did it, and John and them are going. Probably every one of us has said you and me as a subject, which is technically wrong, but in a very informal way of speaking, it almost establishes linguistic intimacy. We might also see variance in use of the comparative and superlative forms. Typically in Standard American English, we add an ER or ES2 to form the comparative and superlative forms. The word bad, however, is irregular in Standard American English. Bad, worse, worst. Some dialects will regularize these irregular forms, forming badder and baddest. If you Google, he's the baddest, you'll find many uses of that form, including in a Nike commercial saying that Kevin Durant, the basketball player, is the baddest. If someone you're evaluating says the baddest when you're assessing acquisition of superlative forms, that is correct if the person you are evaluating has been exposed to that use of the superlative form. It means the most bad, but the meaning of bad is a positive here. We can also see double marking, where more and most are combined with the comparative and superlative forms to create phrases like more better or more awfulest. Now, one of the most important considerations in distinguishing a language difference from a language disorder is the language norm of the speaker's own speech community. So if a student you're assessing presents with some of the grammatical features we've just discussed, and you don't know the dialectal features of their speech community, you might inappropriately identify that student as having a language disorder when they're really showing you they have a language ability in acquiring the grammatical features of their speech community. Therefore, to distinguish a language difference from a language disorder, we must know the person's language acquisitional history. So what languages and dialects do they speak, and how long have they been speaking them? Remember, people can speak multiple dialects. For example, a child may speak African American English to their friends and Standard American English to their teachers or parents. We also need to know their cultural and linguistic background. What speech communities are they a part of, and what are the cultural and linguistic characteristics of their speech community? These are all important considerations to keep in mind. For ELLS, we need to know what typical development looks like in that student's first language and how that student is developing or was developing in their first language. We also need to know how that person compares to others with a similar background. We can't compare the language of students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds with the language norms of students who speak Standard American English. We need to compare a student's language with that of others in their cultural and linguistic community. Now, before we go any further in discussing language difference versus disorder, let's first discuss some of the fundamentals of Standard American English grammar. The term grammar refers both to morphology, that deals with word structure, and syntax, that deals with sentence structure. A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in a language. For example, the word cups is composed of two morphemes, cup and the plural s. There are different categories of morphemes. Free morphemes can function independently as words like cup, for example. Bound morphemes, on the other hand, can't stand alone as words and must be attached to free morphemes. So, for example, the possessive and plural s and the suffixes fill, full, and meant. Now, there are two different classes of bound morphemes. The first class is called inflectional morphemes, which modify the function of a word without affecting its meaning or class. So, for example, the plural s changes the number of the word cup to cups, and the possessive s indicates the cup is Billy's cup. Inflectional morphemes do not change the meaning or class of a word. They just modify its function. Derivational morphemes, on the other hand, change the semantic meaning or class of the affective word. They, in essence, are used to derive new words. So in the case of beautiful, the full morpheme changes the word beauty from a noun into an adjective. The meant derivational morpheme changes the verb achieve to a noun, achievement. Syntax refers to the arrangement of words, phrases, and clauses, which we'll discuss further in Module 5 of this series. Now, in assessing the language of students, most of us learn to use Brown's morphemes to analyze morphological development and calculate MLU, or mean length of utterance, which is based on the number of morphemes used. We look to see whether third-person singular S inflectional morpheme was present, as in she likes, and that the copula and auxiliary B forms were present, as in he is fine, the copula, and she is diving, the auxiliary. We looked for the regular past tense ED inflectional morphemes, the irregular past tense, and the possessive S inflectional morphemes. We also looked at prepositions, irregular third person, and the progressive ing inflectional morpheme. Don't worry, we're going to discuss all of these terms in further detail later on in the module series. The point here I'm trying to make is that if we use Brown's morphemes and MLU to identify a language disorder for a student exposed to dialects other than Standard American English, or significantly with Standard American English, or to a second language learner, we are likely to have misidentified a language difference as a language disorder. Why? Why does morpheme analysis often confuse a dialect with a disorder? Because many rule-governed dialects of English omit or use morphemes differently from those used in Standard American English. We can't use tests normed on Standard American English to identify disorders in children who speak or are exposed to different dialects and languages. By using Brown's morphemes to identify a disorder, we are just as likely identifying that that student has appropriately acquired the variety of English she or he was exposed to at home in the speech community. In order to disseminate information to help increase the accuracy of disorder versus difference distinctions, this tutorial will include information on how morphological systems vary among common American English dialects. This is one reason why we call it Grammar Fundamentals for a Pluralistic Society. Standard American English is the dialect of power and money in the United States, so it's important that students acquire Standard American English. However, no one should be inappropriately given special education services identified as having a disability simply because they speak a dialect other than Standard American English or come from a community that speaks a different dialect of English. The only way we can distinguish a language difference from a language disorder is to know the child's, student's, adolescent's acquisitional history, language acquisitional history. This concludes Module 1 of Grammar Fundamentals for a Pluralistic Society. The subsequent modules in this series will discuss the grammatical features of various dialects and outline important considerations when assessing the language of individuals from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds.